was reminded of an Australian guy who talked about how businesses and consumers are generally watermelons. There's plenty of scope for lots of millionaires in the future who are currently in their 20s. Are they willing to get up at 4:30 in the morning and drive to a bus depot in Widnes?
It is UKIFDA. It's where the whole of UK and Ireland come together, and later on today in Leeds we've got our live podcast with the previous winners of Young Person of the Year. I'm with our sponsor AIM, who do staffing across the logistics and driving, and please come to the coffee area, anyone who's listening, before they come to Leeds. But we've got one of the people who's one of the thought leaders in this space. We've got the Managing Director of Portland Fuels, James Spencer, joining us. James, great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you very much, Alex. And pleasure and a privilege to be with you.
Last year, I felt, was a really optimistic year about HVO at UKIFDA, in that we seem to have parliamentary support. There was changes in the bills. Lots of the distributors in the UK started supplying HVO options on both road grade diesel and on, we call it red in this country, but for our listeners, it's a rebated supplement for industries that the government feels that need support, or key industries. And HVO was growing momentum. At the same time, in the last year, we've seen the likes of JCB, the likes of BP going very big on hydrogen. And I was recently in the Netherlands, where their ammonia production, which is the sort of source of grey hydrogen, there's great optimism about that potentially being linked to the grid in both Netherlands and Germany from the Netherlands producers to have grey ammonia or hydrogen going into those sectors as a replacement of diesel. 12 months on from the last UKIFDA, where do you feel that the replacement of diesel might be? Because actually some of the other statistics suggest that diesel is as good as ever. We had the Tony Blair Institute talking about a global perspective, but in a UK form, you have customers at the cutting edge every day. I was just wondering the feedback that you've seen and how maybe HVO has progressed and other alternatives to diesel have progressed specifically in the UK market.
So HVO has progressed, but I think there has been bumps in the road, and there will continue to be bumps in the road. Despite that, I would still say it's easily the most likely low carbon fuel, renewable fuel for the sector that we're talking about. So the UKIFDA sector, the petrol retail sector, they are going to be wedded to liquid fuel for a long time. I don't believe there is appetite for too many structural changes in either the distribution network or the end users in terms of the vehicles that use this. We know that HVO has tremendous benefits because it's what's called a drop-in fuel, so you can just interchange that with normal diesel. So I believe HVO will be the renewable fuels of choice. I think when it comes to things like the grid, I think in terms of overall energy, I think the likes of hydrogen, ammonia, or ammonia derived hydrogen, I think these have much bigger chances of success. So for example, you're going to put renewables or green energy into the system at the easiest point and the quickest point. So for example, there was a lot of talk a few years ago about you could produce hydrogen from wind turbines. So wind turbines could generate hydrogen. But the obvious question is, why would you do that? Because once you've got a wind turbine going, you can plug it straight into the grid and just power the grid. You generate all of the certificates, albeit it's not a liquid fuel certificate, but it's a renewable energy certificates. Why would you bother with the extra manufacturing of to make it into hydrogen so that you could make it into a road fuel, for example? So I do see something like hydrogen, ammonia. There's lots of talk about ammonia for shipping. Again, There may be some logic there because the distribution system is slightly different. But when it comes to road fuels, when it comes to downstream ground fuels that we use in the UK, I don't see there's any other player in town apart from HVO. I think where there's a lack of realism is going to be the price. And funny enough, over the last few months, the prices have really equalised. So HVO has been quite an attractive option. It's been more expensive than diesel. Obviously, a lot of UKIFDA members are very keen to try and put it into heating oil. That's still not confirmed. There's quite a lot of work to be done there. But again, it's a suitable fuel for that. But we are possibly back to the Trump effect here, because a lot of HVO coming into the UK, specifically into the UK, was coming in from the USA. The USA had incentivized through the Biden Act and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was misnamed really. It was just it was an environmental policy, but they called it the IRA, probably because if he called it environmental, it just would have upset too many people. But there were lots of incentives for producing biofuels, and specifically renewable diesel, HVO, and a lot of that was coming into Europe and the UK. Those incentives have now gone. Production in the USA is way down. There's really only one market for renewable diesel, HVO, which is in California. And there's an oversupply position in California. And what's more, the only way you can get credits for HVO in the States is to sell it domestically. So there's no credits to be gained by exporting it to the UK or Europe. So we've already seen a reversing of HVO flows. Most of the HVO in the UK is now coming again from Europe. But broadly speaking, whereas in crude oil terms, we see oversupply and stagnating demand. When it comes to HVO, we are seeing reducing supply and demand based on contractual arrangements. People have been slowly going to the HVO space. Demand looking pretty strong. What that's going to do is fairly obvious. It's going to push up prices, and that differential between HVO and diesel will start to look quite stark again. And then it's a question of whether all these businesses that have been happy to say how green they are by taking HVO, and consumers less so, to be fair, it's more being driven by businesses, whether they're willing to say, yeah, we are actually green despite the fact that the price is way higher. It's not really being green if it's a parity price. Then you're just taking parity price. True environmental kind of activity comes from paying more. And I a long time ago now, but I was reminded of an Australian guy who talked about how businesses and consumers are generally watermelons when it comes to the environment. And the idea being that they're green on the outside, but they're pretty red on the inside. And yeah, I think that's probably true. Most people want to be green. Most people like to say they're green. Very few people are willing to pay for it.
It's a really good question, because just one follow-up question on that area. I think not just the US side. Obviously, we've seen since the last UKIFDA 12 months on, the big European HVO supplier, Neste, makes significant redundancies, which would be an indication to me that not all is well there, and they've struggled to get the customer base to make it profitable to keep the workforce they had. Is that a fair reflection, or do you think there's more complicated factors?
I think it's slight. I mean, HVO demand. I think they're suffering because there's been more supply. So Neste, historically, let's say for the last 10 years, have had not quite a monopoly, but broadly speaking, a monopoly and monopolistic position in terms of HVO supply. They've been the main suppliers, so therefore they've been able to, make decent margins on the basis there's been less competition. Like I say, it's not a monopoly. That's a bit harsh, but yeah. If you're the only supplier for many, many years, you're going to do well. What you've now seen, albeit it's beginning to slow up in 2025, but you've had all this US production that's been arriving on European shores. BP have been producing HVO. Other refiners, I think Total have got HVO production. ENI, the Italian refiner. So there's been a lot more HVO coming into the market. So I think that has undoubtedly affected Neste's end results and their profitability, coupled with something that affects all refiners, because Neste still produce normal diesel as well as HVO and they produce petrol, and they're a refiner. Refinery margins are they're not terrible. They're better than they were probably, well, certainly over many years. They're still a reasonable refinery margins available, but they're way down on 22, 23, 24. So refinery margins are being squeezed. So overall, I think that's made for less profitable times for Neste.
Now, there's going to be a lot of talk in Yorkshire this week as we all meet in Leeds. And I think the biggest thing everyone's going to be talking about is that it's the lowest forecourt fuel price we've seen in nearly 4 years in this country. And after kind of a stable period, kind of from 2022 to kind of the start of this year, suddenly we've had this quite significant drop. What are the consequences of that, and what's happening in the industry, and why did we get to this place?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been interesting to see. I think people kind of got used to prices sitting at a certain level, let's say a high level, for several years. And over the last, really since tail end of last year, beginning of this year, 2025, we have seen prices significantly come down and materially come down. So, 15 pence a litre if you actually kind of go over the period. And I think that's, as you just said, that's the first time for a long time we've seen that. And I think people did get to the point where they thought they would never see that again. So that's quite interesting. Obviously, the consequences for consumers, for businesses, I mean, as I say, it's a material drop. So prices down, it will have a deflationary or a non-inflationary impact as those prices come down. I think for the sector that we're in, or the UKIFDA, the sector that is represented by UKIFDA, it is business as usual. So probably the only other point worth mentioning for UKIFDA members is, of course, as the price comes down, credit and credit facilities are a big issue for people who buy and sell fuel. So obviously the price coming down, they can afford to buy more fuel. So one would expect that credit limits would be less stretched than they perhaps were 12 months ago.
I think that's a great point, James, because I think a lot of people who don't really know from the business side, on a customer, you might get £100,000 limit, but that doesn't matter if a price of fuel is £1.10 a litre, 1.30 a litre or 80p a litre, and as you said, it means you can get more litres, which means potentially more margin per litre, but you've got the same credit limit. But I'm more interested in some of the causes of why it came down. Is it overproduction, or has the world economy crashed, or is it a mixture of the two?
I mean, it is. You can often make these things more complicated than they are. Fundamentally, there is oversupply, and let's not say necessarily reducing demand, but demand is fairly stagnant, looking fairly shaky. Put those two together, you clearly have a recipe for prices dropping.
So we're in a market of prices dropping. Obviously in Leeds today, there's going to be a number of people that have distribution companies, a number of people forecourt sellers, and a mixture of the both in that mix. What do you think will be, and you've already mentioned that the credit option in terms of a silver lining might be a bit of credit options, but can you tell us for those companies some of the effects that might be having if they're very on lagged pricing, like the retail customers, and also what might be happening on their large fleet customers, whether large fleet customers might be able to pass it on in their pricing to their end users?
Okay, so there's quite a lot to unravel there. I mean, in terms of the impact of the weekly lagged concept, so a lot of buyers of fuel will buy their fuel based on the average market price from the previous week. So sometimes that's known as the Rotterdam weekly lag price, sometimes the Platts weekly lag price. It basically means that, for example, here we are this week, my prices for buying fuel as a wholesaler ready to sell that on are based on the average of last week. So obviously in a continually falling market, that means that you are buying your prices at a higher level than today's spot price, i.e. today's market price. So those bigger buyers that tend to have contractual arrangements where they're buying on a weekly lag basis and they've done that for many, many years, they can be uncompetitive against spot buyers. Now, spot buyers tend to be, not always, but they tend to be slightly smaller. They tend to be dipping in and out of the market when it suits them. So what you can see is retailers becoming quite uncompetitive, or wholesalers in the distributor sector becoming uncompetitive against perhaps those who are wheeler dealing and going to the market and say, right, I just want the prevailing price today. So, I think it's something like 16 out of the last 20 weeks, prices have gone down. So that has an effect. But again, long term, these things should even out. You should be looking at more attractive prices for consumers. Again, it's very much a macro kind of outcome, because at the end of the day, you don't just drive for the sake of it just because you got cheap petrol. The elephant in the room is clearly, if we are heading into recession, all of the goodwill generated by low prices is offset by the fear that there is going to be no demand, because actually it doesn't matter how much money I'm saving on my petrol. If business is bad, if people are being laid off, all these kind of things, well, I don't have any spare money to spend, so I ain't going to drive. So I clearly would say we're not in that position in the UK. I don't think we're in that position globally. But the obvious statement is there's so much uncertainty around the Trump tariffs. Will that push the world into a recession? I would say, based on the initial tariffs announced and all the headlines that came with Liberation Day, which was April the 2nd, I think that was Trump's term for what he did. I think if those had stayed in place, you are guaranteed to look at a recession, both in the US, 100% in China, because obviously their manufacturing is affected, and almost certainly Europe would be caught in the collateral damage. However, what we've already seen is a reining back of these kind of tariffs, that the original tariff set, Trump is, I didn't really mean it, or was it just his negotiation style, go in with a kind of nuclear option, then unwind it. There does seem to be some evidence of that. So uncertainty is the byword. If you go to April the 2nd, and the reaction of the stock markets, the bond markets, every single global market took a massive hit in the wake of the announcement of the tariffs. So they're not always right. I think you and I, Alex, have followed oil markets and commodity markets long enough to know that forward prices are not 100% an indication of what's going to happen. But you could safely say that the global view in the markets was that the tariffs would cause a recession. We don't know whether that is going to be the outcome, but at the moment you would probably be a little bit gloomy for the world economic performance, and therefore the likelihood of recession, simply because the tariffs, although they're being reined back a bit, they still are in place, and they probably will glue up trade or slow up trade.
And that leads me nicely. Today, we've got the live podcast, but before us, you're giving a talk on the Trump effect. I'd just like to take you back a few weeks. So on around the sort of end of April was International Energy Week in London. There, the guys at S&P Global, own Platts, did a very nice sort of economics talk of showing how world political events and fuel prices don't actually have closest link as possibly people might think. I know people's thinking is conflict happens in an energy providing or oil rich country, that has a very bad effect. Big tariff announcements, like you said, can have a very big economic impact and effect on the fuel. But what do you think actually sort of rolling the Trump effect, as you say, in terms of the nuclear option and coming back? It's already talking this week about a better deal for the UK. Not all the details have come out, but it's indicated such things as allowances for high-end luxury British car makers to get pretty much a similar deal to they had before. But in your talk today, what do you think the long-term consequence? Because a lot of people also feel that Trump is trying to give America more market share by almost making America a better value place to trade with. And actually, that's why taking some of the value out of the dollar and so on could increase that. So in your talk today, what will you be covering to sort of, and to share with our audience who can't be in Leeds today, but are in our 65 other countries?
Sure. Well, again, lots of subjects there. I mean, if you go back to the starting question about when, because I was to International Energy Week in London, great event, some fantastic speakers, and the point was made that effectively politics doesn't control oil prices. There's the fundamentals control oil prices, and broadly speaking, I think that's correct. So if you go back to 2024, supply was increasing all the time. So you had Guyana was bringing on 2 million barrels per day. There were some smaller plays in West Africa that were coming on. The USA was increasing its production. And all of that was happening whilst Chinese demand was starting to stagnate, partly on the back of their property crisis. Their activity was down. Now, don't get me wrong, the Chinese economy was still growing. Therefore, there was demand out there for oil products, but it wasn't growing at anything like the rate that we saw, for example, 10 years ago. So as we came to the end of 2024 and going into 2025, you had oversupply in the market. You had all this new volume coming on, and then limited options for demand where that supply was going to go. And of course, as we know, Russian volume was still being pumped out despite the sanctions. They were, that oil is still finding its way to global markets. It's just going a different route. So it's, in very basic terms, rather than Russia exporting diesel to Europe and the UK. So prior to the Ukrainian invasion, Britain was buying 25% of its diesel from Russia. That diesel is still coming into the UK. It's just the crude oil is going to Indian refineries, being made into diesel and then shipped round to Europe. So Russian oil hasn't disappeared. Lots of new oil coming on the markets. The result is oversupply because there's just not enough places to put it. So broadly speaking, I do believe that supply and demand, oil prices, commodity markets in general are not affected by politics. However, when you get something like Liberation Day, maybe that's the exception, because Liberation Day was so kind of staggeringly big in scale that suddenly politics does have an impact. And all of these exceptions that are now being brought in, you've had the new announcement with the Chinese tariffs. It's going to be monstrously complicated to administer all of this, but that's perhaps by the by. I think ultimately Trump's tariffs, because they have the potential to send the global economy into some form of recession, that is now overlaying the fundamentals, which is supply is greater than demand. So it's kind of like an extra kick in a negative direction. Prices coming down. Now we've got a potential recession. Prices come down even further. But from a consumer perspective, let's be clear, this is good news. So prices coming down. Obviously our business, we've focused a lot on protecting consumers and businesses from rising prices. So falling prices tend to be not great news for us because we like to provide protection to customers against rising prices. But let's not beat about the bush. Falling prices for businesses and consumers is a good thing.
And it does feel that kind of since Liz Truss in the UK, for a number of different reasons, that the economy has felt quite flat, and what degree you go to on that flatness, but it doesn't feel like a time of huge optimism. What I'm interested is that when you see times like this, and I'm kind of interested from two stakeholders. One is the actual physical distributor, what they should do during flat economic times. And the other is, say, the industry buyer of fuel. You have run a business now for a significant amount of time. Before that, you were in the majors. When you enter these kind of flatter parts of the economy, what do you think is key to running a good business, to getting out the other side? Because we're not quite sure when the good times come back, but it's not like we're going into a year of huge optimism. So I was just wondering, as a business leader, what you think both the distributors should be doing, and also if you are a buyer of fuel, what you should be thinking about.
So I think I'm a great believer in attention to detail. I think the there's lots of businesses out there that enjoy the good times because fundamentally in the good times it's easy. It's easy to be successful in the good times. You don't have to have attention to detail. You don't have to have kind of robust processes in place, etc., etc. So, to a certain extent, if the bad times hit and you're not ready for that because it's a bit late in the day to suddenly think, oh, I maybe need some rigidity of process here and I need to focus on attention to detail. So I think if you have focused on optimizing your assets in whatever sense that bit may be, in terms of staff numbers, in terms of your processing, your use of IT, your efficiency in dealing with customers, if you have focused on that through the good times as well as the bad times, and you've done that for a number of years, I suspect that you're not going to be too affected by the downtime, the downtimes. It is probably worth remembering that a lot of distributors, they for many years have been operating in a market where there is shrinking demand. Heating oil in the 1980s was something like 5 million tons a year. Heating oil now is 2 million tons. So this is a declining market, and that is not going to change. So distributors are used to declining volumes, and to a certain extent, petrol, less so much declining volumes, but in terms of petrol retail, we can certainly say, there were 20,000 petrol stations in 1980. There's now 8,000 petrol stations in the UK in 2025. So they're both in their own way declining markets, and both sectors have seen really successful businesses being more efficient, looking after their customers more efficiently and better. And so the declining market share isn't the end of the world. So I think good companies will come through this very well. On the one hand, prices are coming down, so that's great. So you're going to be saving money. But of course, everybody's in the same boat. So all your competitors are going to be spending less on their fuel as well. So you don't actually have a commercial advantage versus your competitors. And if we do head into a recession, or let's just call it a stagnating economy, then you're still going to have to be efficient and look after your customers in an efficient way to come out on top. I don't think there's too much rocket science to it. I think if you have good people and you're focused on optimizing your business all the time and you don't get complacent, I think you'll be fine. One thing I think is worth flagging for the fuel sector and specifically for the UKIFDA members, I think a lot of people have overlooked the defence spending uplift that is not only going to take place in the UK but across Europe. So whilst it's not going to happen overnight, an increase of GDP spending on defence from 2 to 4%, which is what's being talked about. I think it's going to be 3.2% initially. That's the target, but it's a big increase. So we are talking about billions more pounds. I'm simplifying that because, of course, the defence spending is much more likely to be done on drones as it is in old-fashioned tanks. You could argue that this is the dreams of all of the stagnant European economies that are desperately trying to generate growth. You could argue this is the answer to their prayers because defence gives them the reason to spend more money and generate growth in the economy. But that will almost certainly, if not certainly, have a knock-on effect in terms of fuel consumption. So, I guess companies that are involved in the defence sector, supplying the defence industry, they may do quite well out of this.
I think that leads nicely then, because as I like to see myself as the happiest man in the energy industry, so I always like to talk a bit about optimism as well. You've obviously talked about defence there, but I found it quite interesting. I was with some of the guys from Accenture a few weeks back, and they're actually saying government capital projects team, which is like their planning teams and so on, has had more revenue and more take up than actually their financial sector team, which said to me big infrastructure projects are coming. We also have that growing need for data centers, and in terms of liquid fuel, there is always going to be a backup system that is of an origin that's off-grid that many of the people in UKIFDA will be supplying. So I was just wondering, therefore, actually for the year ahead, sort of shoots of optimism that distributors should be looking forward to and potentially discussing in Leeds later on today.
I'd be guilty of actually just kind of repeating what you just said. I mean, I think actually big infrastructure projects, there's loads going on. I mean, it's been scandalous how long it's taken to get to this stage, but the second tunnel under the Thames, so going through Woolwich, I mean, that's been approved now. I mean, that's a huge piece of work. So, you know, if you're a fuel distributor in the southeast, you probably need to go and talk to the fuel distributors that are in the Midlands, who have been reaping the rewards of HS2. And, you know, again, HS2 turned out to be a bit of a white elephant, but it still generated a lot of economic activity. It's ending north of Birmingham now. But, you know, that construction site, the construction that's gone along with HS2 has generated huge amounts of fuel demand, you know, for the generators, for the plant and equipment that's being used. So big infrastructure projects, although on paper they often look this kind of concept of the white elephant, you know, there's huge amounts of money being spent, but I think, and that's fine to criticize them because they are often out of control and everything else, but I think fuel distributors should probably be a bit circumspect about complaining too much, for example, of HS2, because fuel distributors have done very, very well from the likes of HS2. So big infrastructure projects, as I say, I think the defence sector will start to pick up. So yeah, I think those two areas are reasons to be optimistic. And as we know, there's always niches. There's always niches to go after, you know. So, you know, you've got a lot of offshore wind turbines. Well, the last time I looked, none of the support vessels are being supplied by wind-powered energy, solar panels. They're all taking marine fuel. So, you know, there is always an opportunity if you just look beyond the obvious. If you decide to stay on the obvious, then you've got to be very, very efficient, and you've got to absolutely optimize everything. I think there's lots of companies making great money just by doing the same thing that they've always done, but they are invariably super efficient at doing that.
I think that's a very good thing to point towards. I think when it comes to efficiency, leads nicely to the right workforce. I've always felt that someone who's great at their job normally adds the equivalent of 3 to 4 headcount, because they're just that person. You give them something, they get it done, they do it. But it's just interesting, as a managing director that has led a team and you've developed some of the key people in the industry, what tips would you give about creating the right workforce? Because I can imagine over that time, you've kind of seen it with both hats when you developed your own career, but also now that you've got a really decent team, is like, what tips would you give to like developing that correct team, that correct workforce? Because as you said, when it comes to efficiency, people doing a job well, nothing can really beat that.
There's a lot to go at there, and obviously it's a fascinating area to discuss. I think if you the headline for me is always, there's a lot in it, it's an obvious statement, but there's a lot of BS out there. You know, there's a lot of people saying they're brilliant, they've done this, they've done that. For me, it comes down to one thing, and as people develop in their career, they tend to be less willing to do this. But, you know, I just put it out there and say, if I'm interviewing someone, I'm asking myself the question, are they willing to get up at 4:30 in the morning and drive to a bus depot in Widnes to have a meeting, because that's the only time that the customer can hold that meeting? And that completely flies in the face of the more modern way of, you know, flexible time working. And, you know, if you did that, I'll need to have some time in lieu, etc., etc. I don't buy that, and I never have. Of course, if someone has done that and got up really early, I might say to them, fine, take Friday afternoon off, you can leave a couple of hours early. But there's no obligation and there's no expectation that that happens. And so I constantly look at whether people are hungry to actually go the extra mile. And lots of people talk about their willingness to do that. Very few people are actually willing to do that. And that's a very difficult thing to tease out in early stages of interview. However, it's quite obvious once they've started work for you. So I think number one is if you get gut feel about people in their early days with you that they're not right, just trust your gut. Get rid of them faster, as fast as you can, because once they've been in the company a long time, it becomes, as we know, way more difficult. And of course, I don't mind, saying I think the latest idea that there'll be working rights from day one, I think is flawed. I think that's been introduced or potentially introduced by the current government in the UK. I don't believe that you should have working rights from day one. I think most people need to get into a job and see what they're like, see whether the company is right for them, see whether the individual is right for the company. And I think that takes, maybe it takes 6 months, but it's definitely not from day one. The second thing I would say is, how do you get this kind of hunger and this willingness to go the extra mile? And counter to what I think most people would say is, I believe young people are the finest kind of exemplar of that attitude. When I go to events, sometimes if you sit down with other managing directors or what have you, almost always their biggest complaint is young people today. They're lazy, they're entitled, they don't know the value of money, all of these kind of cliches around young people. They're on social media all the time, etc., etc. We've had none of those issues, and we never have. I always go back to these people with one question, and that is, were you involved in their recruitment, and were you involved in their training when they joined? And the answer to both of them is almost always no. So, when you're recruiting a lot of people, obviously, have to put a word out for your sponsors, but obviously, a lot of people, you need help from recruitment agencies, but there is a point where you have to get involved. You can't just leave them to just provide the person and then, oh, well, there you are, sit over there, crack on. If you get involved in the process, be that through the interviewing, the selection process, you're so much more likely to find the right kind of person. Then on day one, you take an active interest. You sit down with people, you provide them with an induction, and the induction involves your time. It involves your other director's time. It involves the manager's time. And then you set out from day one what you expect. This is how we work. So we've never offered work from home option. It's never been something you would offer on day one. That's just known. Nobody asks for it. Now, over time, we have had, through various arrangements, some of our staff will occasionally work from home in the afternoon. But by not having it as an obligation from the start, you are creating, I'm not saying that's the only thing that matters. I'm just saying, whatever your company culture, get it out there on day one so that people are in no the result is that I don't have any of these problems with the young people and, lack of work ethic and inability to talk to customers. We have just a tremendously engaged workforce, and where we haven't had that, we've dealt with it quickly. So we've got rid of people quickly. And so that would be a rather long-winded way of kind of talking about how you get motivated staff and efficient staff.
James, I think you're spot on there in many ways. Later today and next week, guys, the episode is going to be the live recording from Leeds, where we're speaking to the previous 3 winners of UKIFDA's Young Person of the Year. But it reminds me that 4:30 quote of AM is that one of the winners, Emily Yates, Craggs Energy, not only did do the office job, but she also got her class 1 and 2 truck exams, so she could physically jump on a rigid to do deliveries, when the kerosene market was tight, because she was like, that provided more to my company than being sat in an office, and it was part of the reason she won the prize. And I think it sums up that attitude. And I remember my early career going to driver meetings, and I've always lived in West London, but my depots have always been in Essex, and waking up at 4:30 in the morning, and I think my now wife thought it was absolutely bonkers, but I knew I could never get buy-in from people unless I was at that meeting before 6 a.m. when the drivers were getting ready and getting out, because I say, if you don't walk the walk, you can't really talk the talk. So
sounds very familiar.
It's absolutely spot on. So just before we go into our quick fire questions that we ask all of our guests, what's the best way, James, that people can interact with Portland Fuels and keep in touch of what's going on and potentially use Portland Fuels to help them in the energy market?
I think my colleagues would say don't talk to James, because so I mean, obviously we're reasonably well known in the sector, so just come and chat to us, obviously. But my email is easy to find online. We have an email, info@portland-fuel.co.uk. That's constantly monitored. So if you just send an email to that, someone will ring you back, and the right person will ring you back depending on what your inquiry is. But we're, of course, we're a customer-driven business, so we're always very happy to hear from either existing customers or potential customers. Obviously, you would hope that if it's existing customers, they wouldn't use an info email, but there we are. You never know. Just old school email or phone is the way we like it.
Brilliant. For our listeners, in the show notes, if you want to we'll put a link to the Portland website. So just a few quick fire questions that we ask all of our guests. Obviously, some slight slants for you, James, with your background. But the first quick fire question: where are you investing in 2025 in the energy industry, whether that's time or money?
So I think we've always been more driven by the niche kind of angles of the market. So we probably don't have the scale to really compete at the kind of the big project level. So we're always looking for niches. We're always looking for kind of fueling byproducts or fueling derivatives. I don't mean financial derivatives. I just mean, products that are related to the main refined fuel sector. So yeah, that's I think where we were going. So we like niches. If it's a niche, we like it.
Now, obviously, the two of us have both enjoyed fun in our industry, whether it's experiences or the trappings of experiences. But if someone's in their early 20s, do you think they can still come a sort of millionaire or big success story in the fuel industry, especially the liquid fuel side in 2025?
100%. Absolutely positive of that. It may look a bit different to if you like, our trajectory or our experience. But I tend to believe, I mean, for all the talk of decline, the oil industry is still the biggest industry in the world from a commodities perspective. So, there is a bit of rebalancing, and that's right and proper that happens. But I think there's opportunity, be it on the operational side. I don't believe liquid fuels is going to go anywhere. So all of the kind of products, the tank monitoring and the hardware that goes with liquid fuel, distribution of liquid fuel, storing of liquid fuel, measuring of liquid fuel quality, insurance around these things. So, and then there's the buying and selling, and because it's commoditized, that tends to generate tremendous amount of opportunity because volatility, prices moving, all of these things generate opportunity. So, yeah, I think if you are ambitious, and you are willing to listen, and you are willing to take criticism and deal with it in a mature way, and come back and say, right, how am I going to improve on that? I think there's plenty of scope for lots of millionaires in the future who are currently in their 20s.
Brilliant. And then the next thing, in the next 12 months, what would you like potentially, specifically related to energy, not just bang on something that's driven you up the wall this morning, but specifically energy, what would you like the governments in the US, UK and EU potentially to do in the next 12 months?
Yeah, so, I mean, whether it's, I don't think you'll see the manifestation of that in the next 12 months. I think probably a little bit of realism about how our energy is derived. So specifically, I think an element of realism around the North Sea. I think if you take the policy of no new oil fields in the North Sea, if you're going to stick to that, you really have to make sure that the remaining oil fields are given every opportunity to be efficient, maximize their production so that they stay for as long as possible. There is a very strong argument to say, well, why are we stopping new fields in the North Sea when all we're doing is importing that oil from elsewhere, which may or may not be done in such a environmentally friendly way? I think that's valid. But, rather than undoing a policy, which I suspect the UK government is not going to undo that, you have to make it as positive and favourable as possible to the sector that remains, because it's hugely important to the UK economy. The North Sea has been and continues to be a massive part of our economy. The costs of running a UK PLC go up every year with all of the demands, so we need vibrant sectors, and the North Sea oil sector has traditionally been a vibrant sector. And so if the policy stays in place, no new oil fields, well, let's make the existing ones a happy place, at least until they mature or decline into maturity. I think I'd love to see more focus on nuclear energy, and acceptance that nuclear energy is absolutely key. I think with the UK perspective, I think it's maybe not too little too late, but I think we have hollowed out our nuclear energy to the point where, as we know, Hinkley Point is another good for fuel distributors, no doubt. There's lots of fuel going into the building of Hinkley Point B, I think it is. But, you know, fundamentally, that's been built by the French and designed by the Chinese. And it's, or is it the other way around? But either way, it's not British. So that's really disappointing that we've allowed ourselves to get to that stage. And I think that's been very much ideologically driven. Nuclear must be evil, therefore we get rid of it. Well, that's not practical. It's not realistic. So I think realism. I think general realism in terms of energy policy. Renewables have been tremendously successful and they will continue to grow. But we will not live in a world anytime soon, if not ever, where we are 100% on wind turbines, or certainly not in my lifetime, wind turbines, solar panels. That doesn't mean they're going to play a big part. But in the same way that even when we had coal and oil, they weren't the only shows in town. You know, when we had coal and oil in the 70s, we were generating electricity from coal, from oil, from gas. So we need a balanced energy portfolio. It's an obvious statement to say that with all the geopolitical threats, with all of the economic challenges, we need a balanced economic policy. And balance means just that. That means having all things given equal chance to develop and prosper rather than being penalised for what they are.
I think for our listeners, just to say, we've actually got in the can already, but it's going to come out in a few weeks. One of the world nuclear experts, Jennifer from the Atlantic Council, and we've got a cracking episode about small nuclear reactors coming out. And then also to say, on James's point on the North Sea, we're trying to put an episode together at the moment because there's been very strange behaviours about the lack of UK government support, but then Miliband in Norway last week, you know, praising the Norwegians' energy position, and Norway doing the same shelf, the same sea, just from the other side. So we are going to explore that further, guys, and go into that. And then our penultimate question: what would you like to see customers doing in the next 12 months, James?
I think if I'd like to see customers, if they're genuinely focused on being green, I think, you know, walking the walk rather than talking the talk. I mean, it is a little bit embarrassing just how much greenwash over the years has been present. It's just very easy to say that you're green, and then that's all you need to do. You put out a public relations announcement, and you're green, and nobody's scrutinising whether that is that. Well, sorry, not nobody. Lots of people, but in general, there's a kind of a general view that you can say what you're doing one thing, and then nobody's really bothered about what you're actually doing. So I think if you want to be green, you have to pay more, and that's how it is. If you're not willing to pay more, well, that's fine, no problem at all. Go with a cheaper option, but don't pretend you're green.
So I think for all listeners, please enjoy the UKIFDA show. Come and see Noz and I on the AIM Recruit stand throughout the day. And at 12:30, we've got the previous winners to see where their careers have gone to, the Young Person of the Year for UKIFDA. Next week, we've got the actual podcast coming out from UKIFDA in terms of the experiences of those 3 winning individuals and what's happened to them since. I'd really like to thank James Spencer from Portland Fuels. I always love the spring as we go into summertime in the fuel distribution industry. It's our big get together, and I can't wait to see the likes of Ken and Dawn from UKIFDA as we really rock up Leeds and we go to James's home county of Yorkshire. Thank you for your time today, James.
No problem, Alex. Many thanks.